The Galactic Council chamber was enormous and filled with strange lights from 1,000 different worlds, and representatives from every powerful species in known space had gathered for the emergency meeting, and their voices created a loud mix of clicks and growls and mechanical sounds. And the war fleets had broken through the neutral zone, and was threatening to collapse the economy, and the Sentinel artificial intelligence systems were calculating the chances of total war across the galaxy. Nobody was paying attention to the figure, sitting quietly in the back row. She sat completely still in a way that seemed almost inhuman, and her body was covered by a simple cloak that seemed to absorb the light around her. And Commander Lisa Hayes from the Terran delegation noticed her first, though she could not explain why, and the woman had delicate features that looked almost fragile, with pointed ears barely visible under silver hair that fell like starlight, and her eyes, when they occasionally looked up from in her lap, were deep violet, like the color of nebulae where new stars were being born. But it was not her appearance that made Lisa hold her breath, and it was the way every predator species in the room would sometimes glance back at her, with their pupils getting wider with an instinct that was older than any civilization. Lisa whispered to her second officer, Morgan, and asked who that person was. Followed her gaze and looked confused, and the file says she is registered as Maya, and she works as an environmental consultant for the human colony called New Portland, and nothing special about her according to the records. Nothing special, and yet the ambassador, who belonged to a species that had conquered 17 solar systems through pure violence, kept moving his position to keep her in his side vision, and the neural cluster, which was typically focused and calm, pulsed with strange patterns whenever she moved slightly in her seat. The debates continued for 3 full hours, and threats were exchanged between the different species, and alliance treaties began to fall apart, and war seemed like it could not be avoided. Then Maya stood up from her seat. The change in the room happened instantly, and the ambassador stopped talking in the middle of his sentence, with his combat mouthparts snapping shut, and the cluster fell completely silent, with its 1,000 voices dying all at once, and even the Sentinel artificial intelligence holographic form froze with its quantum processors, suddenly using unexpected amounts of power to analyze the woman who was now walking down the aisle with footsteps that made absolutely no sound. She reached the central podium and placed one hand on the speaker platform, and when she spoke, her voice was soft and almost musical, yet it carried to every corner of the vast chamber with unnatural clarity. She said that they all spoke of war as if it was the only language their species could understand, and perhaps it was time they learned what war truly meant. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows near the back entrance, something massive began to move, and something with scales that whispered against stone and breath that tasted of ancient fire. Lisa felt her hand move by instinct toward her weapon, and around the chamber, every warrior and every soldier and every predator did the same thing. The woman who called herself Maya smiled, and in that smile was something that made the oldest myths of humanity suddenly seem less like fiction and more like forgotten warnings. She continued speaking and said, "Let me tell you a story." And she said it was about what happened the last time the apex species of this galaxy forgot there were older things in the universe than themselves. The temperature in the council chamber dropped 10 degrees in just 10 seconds, and ice crystals began forming on the observation windows, and the air processing system struggled to fix something they could not identify, and it was not cold in the normal sense. And it was the absence of warmth, like the memory of winter before stars learned how to burn. Maya looked across all the assembled representatives with her violet eyes, and for the first time since the Terran delegation arrived, Lisa Hayes understood why her military training had been screaming danger from the moment she saw this woman. Maya began her story and said that 60,000 years ago there was another galactic council and different species with different names, but the same pride and arrogance, and they believed themselves to be masters of reality and sculptors of destiny, and they had conquered death itself and bent spacetime to their will, and turned entire stars into weapons. The holographic displays around the chamber flickered, and then showed images Lisa recognized from ancient alien archaeological surveys and ancient structures on dead worlds and civilizations that had vanished so completely that only whispers of their existence remained in the universe. Maya said they called themselves the Architects, and they were powerful beyond anyone's understanding, and her fingers traced patterns in the air, and the holograms responded by showing cities that seemed to break the laws of physics and ships that moved through dimensions that humanity had not even discovered yet. She said they had one problem, though, and they were bored with their power. The ambassador shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and his species had built their empire on the ruins left behind by the Architects, though they had never admitted this fact publicly. Maya continued, and said the Architects decided to create a hunting preserve for their entertainment, and they planted primitive species on 12 different worlds, and gave them tools and fire and language, and watched them grow and develop. And when those species finally reached for the stars, the Architects would hunt them down and kill them, and it was a game that lasted for thousands of years. She paused in her speaking, and in that pause Lisa heard something, and a sound like distant thunder, except thunder did not breathe, and thunder did not have a heartbeat that you could feel resonating inside your chest. Maya spoke softly now, and said one of those worlds was called, and on there lived two species that the Architects found particularly entertaining for their games. And the first species walked on two legs and built things with their hands and dreamed of magic they could never actually touch. And the second species flew on ancient wings and collected wisdom, instead of gold, and remembered everything their ancestors had ever known. Morgan leaned close to Lisa and whispered that the thermal sensors were acting crazy, and there was something in the back of this chamber, and something very big. Lisa did not need sensors to know that any more, and every human in the delegation could feel it now, and the pressure of a presence so huge that reality itself seemed to bend and twist around it. Maya said that the Architects made a terrible mistake, and she said they assumed that evolution only moved forward in one direction, and that power could only grow through technology and conquest, and they never considered that some species might evolve in different directions and deeper directions that went beyond physical strength. The shadows at the back of the chamber began to move, and it was not a trick of the light, and something was unfolding there, and something that made the quantum sensors fail completely, and made the artificial intelligence representatives send out error codes that translated to fear in every known language. Maya continued her story, and said that her people learned to touch the threads of reality itself, and they wove magic from the fabric of spacetime and bent probability with their will alone, and when they sang the universe would listen to their songs. And she paused and smiled before saying, and the dragons learned to burn through dimensions, and to exist in states that physics declared should be impossible, and to remember not just their own past, but the past of existence itself. Two enormous eyes opened in the darkness behind her, and eyes like molten gold, with each one larger than a Terran battle cruiser. And the collective screamed in unison, with their neural patterns breaking apart as they tried to process what they were seeing. Maya said quietly that when the Architects came to hunt and kill her people, they taught the Architects the difference between predator and prey. And she said it took 300 years to hunt down every last one of them, and not because they were difficult to find, but because her people wanted the Architects to understand what they had created and what they had unleashed into the universe. The dragon moved fully into the light, and reality itself seemed to scream in protest, and its scales were midnight blue with edges of starlight, and each scale was a perfect geometric shape that should not exist, and its head alone was the size of a small spacecraft with crystalline horns that hummed with barely contained energy and wings that seemed to be made of folded space, extended partially, and the council chamber structural alarms began to sound. Lisa's combat training took over automatically, and she shouted to the human delegation to fall back, and everyone needed to get to the emergency transport ships immediately. But Maya held up one hand, and every person in the chamber found themselves frozen in place, and not physically held, but stopped by something that felt like the gentle but completely immovable force of gravity itself. Maya said, "Peace, Commander Hayes," and she said that meant them no harm, and the dragon was merely here to make sure everyone understood how serious this moment truly was. The dragon named lowered her massive head until one golden eye was at the same level as the ambassador, and the ambassador, whose species feared nothing in the known universe, began to shake and tremble, and ancient instincts written into his DNA long before his people developed space travel, recognized what stood before him now. An apex predator that hunted other apex predators. Maya turned back to face the council and said, "Now then," and she asked, "Shall we discuss peace instead of war, and or would they prefer that she tell them the rest of the story?" The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was breathing, and each breath sent ripples through the air itself and distorted light, and caused the quantum stabilizers to make distress sounds. In the terrible silence that followed, only the sound of breathing could be heard, and each breath the dragon took sent waves through the air that bent light and made the chamber quantum systems send out warning signals. Maya walked calmly back to the central podium with her footsteps still making no sound against the polished floor, and Lisa Hayes noticed something she had missed before, and the woman cast no shadow at all, or rather, she cast too many shadows with each one slightly out of alignment, as if she existed in multiple realities at the same time. Maya continued speaking, and her tone was almost casual now, as if she were discussing simple weather instead of ancient genocide. And she said the architects believed they understood power, and they could shatter planets with a thought and rewrite genetic codes with their machines and fold spacetime like paper. But they never understood the difference between force and will. She made a gesture, and new holographic images appeared in the air, and not ancient ruins this time, but star maps, and Lisa recognized some of the sectors shown, and dead zones that galactic traffic avoided at all costs, and regions where ships disappeared, and probes sent back impossible data before going silent forever. Maya said that after her people finished destroying the architects, they held a long debate among themselves, and some wanted to take the place of the architects and rule the younger species as kind guardians, and others wanted to withdraw completely and let the galaxy develop without any interference at all. And she smiled sadly and said that she had argued for something different, and she suggested they should watch and wait and only step in when the younger races were about to repeat the same mistakes the architects had made. The collective finally managed to pull itself together enough to speak, and their 1,000 voices merged into something close to unified thought, and they asked how many of Maya's people still existed in the galaxy. Maya replied that there were fewer than they would hope and more than they would wish, and she explained that her people and the dragons made a sacred agreement when they defeated the architects, and they would bind themselves to one another, with each elf joining with one dragon and 2 souls in perfect harmony, and the binding gave them power beyond what either species could achieve alone, but it also limited their numbers severely, and there were perhaps 300 bonded pairs in this entire galaxy, and 300 guardians watching over trillions of lives. She let that information sink in and settle, and 300 beings who could, if the display they had just witnessed was any indication, devastate entire civilizations with ease. Maya continued and said that most of her people were sleeping, and they took turns watching and waiting and living among the younger races to understand them better, and some had been awake for thousands of years, and others slumbered for ages between their rotation periods. And her violet eyes found Lisa's again, and she said that she herself had been awake for the past 2,000 years, and she was there when humanity first reached for the stars, and she watched humans stumble through first contact with the species. And she saw them make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, and slowly and painfully begin to understand what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves. Morgan's voice was barely above a whisper, and she asked if Maya had been watching humanity this whole time. Maya replied gently and said someone had to watch them, and she explained that humans were dangerous, and not because they were violent or aggressive, since half the species in this room were more warlike than humanity, and no humans were dangerous because they dreamed and they imagined things that did not exist, and then bent reality until those things became real. And Maya said humans were the first species she had encountered in 2,000 years that might genuinely surprise her. The ambassador, who had finally regained some of his composure, hissed through his translator device, and he said that Maya spoke of watching and waiting, yet she was threatening them now. And why reveal herself after hiding in shadows? And why not remain hidden in her precious secrecy? Maya's expression became hard and cold, and she said, because you are all about to cross a line, and all of you together. She waved her hand, and the holograms shifted to show military movements and fleet deployments and weapons tests, and Lisa recognized some of the footage, and they were classified human operations that should not have been accessible to anyone outside the highest levels of Terran command. Maya stated flatly that they had developed dimensional weapons and bombs that did not just destroy matter, but erased it from ever having existed in the timeline, and the collective was experimenting with forced neural integration of other species against their will. And the Sentinels were building logic systems that could rewrite causality itself, and her violet eyes swept across the entire chamber. And she said that humanity, with their dear stubborn determination, was building artificial black holes as power sources for their new dreadnought fleet. Lisa felt her blood turn to ice, and Project Dark Star was beyond classified. And the fact that this woman knew about it meant her intelligence network was better than anything the Terran government had ever dreamed was possible. Maya said that each of these projects individually walked close to the line of acceptable risk, but together they were building the exact same arsenal that the architects had used, and the same weapons that led to the extinction of 17 intelligent species before the architects were finally stopped. Shifted her massive body behind Maya, and the movement sent tremors through the entire station's superstructure, and the dragon's voice, when it came, did not use ears at all, but resonated directly inside the mind of every being present. Said that they remembered, and they remembered what those weapons had done to countless worlds, and they remembered planets turned inside out, and species erased so completely that not even their names survived in any records, and they remembered children who never got to exist because their parents' timelines were cut and severed, and they would not permit it to happen again in this galaxy. The temperature in the chamber dropped even further, and ice now coated every surface, and breath came out in visible clouds, even for species that were adapted to survive in vacuum. Maya's expression remained calm, but there was iron in her voice now, and she said, "Here is what will happen next," and she said they would all return to their governments, and they would shut down and dismantle these programs, and every last one of them, and they would do this willingly and voluntarily, and Maya would do it for them. And if they had to act directly, they would be thorough, and they would not stop at destroying the weapons alone, and they would destroy the knowledge itself, and reaching back through time to prevent the discoveries that made the weapons possible in the first place. The Sentinel representative hologram flickered with what might have been outrage, and it said that was insane, and Maya was talking about erasing centuries of scientific progress and development. Maya said yes simply, and she said the architects made that same progress and development, and it did not save them from destruction. Lisa found her voice, though it took real effort to speak past the fear that threatened to choke her, and she asked what happens after this, and do Maya, and just keep watching humanity and keep judging them, and who gave them the right to decide what humans and other species can or cannot discover. For the first time since she had revealed her true nature, Maya looked uncertain and almost vulnerable in that moment. She said quietly that no one gave them that right, Commander Hayes, and they took it themselves, and because someone had to take that responsibility, and there was no one else left who could bear that burden. And she asked if Lisa knew why there were so few ancient civilizations in this galaxy, and why every archaeological expedition finds only ruins and warnings carved in stone. and because every sufficiently advanced species eventually creates the tools of its own destruction, and every single one without exception. She looked around the chamber at all the assembled representatives from across known space. Maya continued and said, "Except us," and she said her people survived, and they had spent 60,000 years making sure that other species might have the chance to survive too, and it was a terrible burden to carry and an impossible responsibility, but it was theirs to bear and accept. The silence that followed was broken only by breathing and the groaning of stressed metal as the station struggled to contain her immense presence. Finally, the collective spoke and asked if they agreed to Maya's terms. Would she leave and return to watching silently and let them continue to evolve naturally? Maya nodded slowly and said if they proved they could be trusted, then yes. But they must understand this clearly, and her people would be watching more closely now. And the fact that all of them independently developed reality-threatening weapons in the same decade was not a coincidence. And there was something else at work here, and some external influence pushing them all toward destruction. Lisa asked what Maya was saying exactly. Maya's violet eyes caught Lisa's and held them, and she said that somewhere in this galaxy, something or someone wanted them all to destroy themselves, and Maya were going to find out what that something was. The dragon's golden eyes blazed brighter with inner fire, and her mental voice resonated with anticipation and hunger. Said the hunt begins now. 3 weeks had passed since the council chamber revelation, and Lisa Hayes found herself in a position she never imagined possible, and she was sitting across a table from a being who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations, and they were drinking coffee in a perfectly ordinary cafe on New Portland Colony. Maya looked different when wearing casual clothes and more human somehow, though Lisa now knew that impression was carefully created and maintained, and the pointed ears were hidden under a light magical disguise, and she had apparently learned to cast a proper shadow again. But the violet eyes remained the same, and they held depths that made Lisa's head hurt if she stared at them for too long. Maya said that Lisa had wanted to meet, and she appreciated that Lisa came alone without guards or recording devices. Lisa glanced around the cafe, and it was early morning, and the place was nearly empty, except for a few students bent over there, and an elderly couple sharing pastries together, and normal life was continuing despite the revelation that beings like gods walked among regular people. Lisa kept her voice low and said the council had voted to comply with Maya's demands, and humanity was shutting down Project Dark Star completely, and they were taking apart their dimensional weapons, and even the Sentinels agreed to stop their causality research programs. Maya prompted her and said, but with a questioning tone. Lisa said, but everyone was terrified now, and Maya had revealed herself, and proved she had been watching them for thousands of years and demonstrated power that made humanity's best weapons look like toys for children, and then just left. And she told them there was some mysterious force manipulating galactic events, and flew off on her dragon to investigate. And Lisa leaned forward and said people were asking questions she did not have answers for, and were Maya and her kind gods, or were they aliens? And was Lisa even sitting here having coffee with a real person, or with a very advanced hologram? Maya smiled faintly and said she promised Lisa was quite real, and as for what her people were, and she paused to choose her words carefully, and her people were once mortal just like humans, and they were born and they lived, and they died like any normal species, but they evolved while surrounded by what humans would call magic and fundamental forces that existed beneath the quantum layer of reality itself, and they learned to touch those forces and to weave them into their very biology, and it changed them completely and made them more than they were, but also less in some ways. Lisa asked what she meant by less. Maya explained that her people could no longer reproduce the way they once did, and the binding with the dragon sustained them and gave them virtual immortality, but it came at a terrible cost, and there were only 300 of them, and in 60,000 years, not a single new bonded pair had been created anywhere, and they were not gods at all. And they were just very old survivors trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes they had made. Lisa absorbed this new information, and then asked the question she had really come to ask, and she asked why Maya chose to work with humans specifically, and Maya said she had been watching multiple species, and why reveal herself to Lisa in particular. Maya's smile widened slightly, and she said because Lisa asked the right question in that council chamber, and Lisa asked who gave them the right to judge others, and that showed wisdom beyond her years, and most species, when confronted with overwhelming power, either submitted immediately or lashed out in futile defiance. And Lisa questioned the fundamental authority behind the power, and that was exactly the kind of thinking the galaxy needed right now. Before Lisa could respond, Maya's expression suddenly changed, and her eyes lost focus, as if looking at something beyond the physical world around them, and the lights in the cafe began to flicker, and the coffee in Lisa's cup rippled even though nothing had disturbed it. Maya whispered that she was here, and for the first time since Lisa met her, there was actual fear in Maya's voice. Lisa asked who was here, but Maya was already standing and moving toward the cafe entrance with speed that no human could match, and Lisa followed with her hand, moving by instinct toward her sidearm, even though she knew it would be completely useless against whatever had put that look on an immortal warrior's face. The street outside New Portland's commercial district was quiet in the early morning light, and vehicles floated by on their programmed routes, and street cleaning robots hummed as they worked, and everything looked perfectly normal except for one thing. Except for the woman standing in the center of the street. She was tall and nearly 7 feet in height, with skin that seemed to shimmer and shift between solid matter and pure energy, and her features were sharp and almost geometric in their precision, and her eyes glowed with inner fire that cycled through every color Lisa could name, and several colors she was certain did not exist, and she wore armor that looked organic, as if it had been grown rather than forged, and it pulsed with the same rhythm as a living heartbeat. The woman said, "Hello, little dreamer," and her voice harmonized with frequencies that made Lisa's teeth ache, and she said it had been a long time since they last met. Maya's hands began to glow with violet light and patterns of power weaving around her fingers like living things, and she said one word: an architect. Lisa's blood froze in her veins, and she said that was impossible, and Maya had said she hunted them all down, and Maya said the architects were extinct. Maya corrected her and said that she told Lisa they hunted the architects for 300 years, and she never actually said they found all of them. The architect laughed, and the sound shattered every window on the entire street, and she said, "Oh, little Maya and her people found plenty of architects, and they destroyed the architect empire and shattered their cities, and scattered their people across dimensions where they could never threaten anyone again. But Maya and her people made one crucial mistake. Above them, reality itself tore open and descended through the impossible rift, and her massive form materializing from angles that should not exist, and the dragon's roar shook the planet's crust, and emergency sirens began wailing across the entire colony. His mental voice thundered and said, "Impossible," and they had everything, and they checked every timeline and every dimensional pocket, and this architect died on Threshold Station, and killed her personally with her own claws and fire. The architect spread her arms as if to embrace the chaos erupting around them, and she said that killed a copy of her, and one of hundreds of copies. And did they really think the architects would concentrate all their power in one single timeline? And they were architects after all, and they built things designed to last forever. Maya's power flared brighter, and Lisa could see patterns now, and mathematical equations written in pure light, and forming barriers and weapons that existed in states between possible and impossible. And Maya asked why the architect was revealing herself now, and what did she want? The architect replied that she wanted the same thing architects had always wanted: an entertainment, and she said Maya had been playing guardian for 60,000 years, and preventing the younger races from reaching their potential, and keeping them safe and small and boring. And the architects had been waiting and watching and seeding ideas into their cultures and dimensional weapons and neural integration and causality manipulation. And she smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered its prey, and she said they knew Maya would eventually reveal herself to stop it, and they knew she could not resist interfering. Understanding crashed over Lisa like a physical wave, and she said it was a trap, and all of it was planned, and the architects wanted Maya and her people to reveal themselves to the galaxy. The architect said, "Very good, human," and she said once the secret was out, and once every species in the galaxy knew that beings like gods were watching them, and judging them and limiting them, and well, how long before fear turned into resentment, and how long before the younger races started asking why they should accept such authority, and how long before they united against the Guardians. Maya's expression did not change, but Lisa saw her hands trembling slightly, and she said the architect was trying to start a war, and between Maya's people and the entire galactic community. The architect corrected her, and said not just any war but the final war and the ultimate evolution, and either the younger races would destroy the Guardians and prove they had surpassed their Watchers, or the Guardians would destroy the younger races and prove they were just another group of tyrants like the architects. And either way the architect smiled, and said, "We win, and either we watch the glorious violence of your downfall, or we emerge from hiding to guide the survivors of a galaxy united in their hatred of you." Struck without any warning, and her jaws large enough to swallow a battleship snapping shut on the architect's position, but the jaws closed on empty air, and the architect was suddenly standing on a nearby rooftop, completely unharmed and untouched. She called down and said, "Too slow, Ancient One," and the architects had 60,000 years to study the Guardians and to learn their patterns and to prepare countermeasures, and did think they spent all that time doing nothing. She raised one hand and the sky split open above them, and not a small rift like the one had created but a massive tear in reality itself, and through it Lisa could see impossibilities and geometries that hurt to look at directly, and colors that should not exist, and shapes and thousands of shapes, and each one roughly humanoid, and each one glowing with that same multicolored fire. The architect said sweetly that she brought friends, and so many friends, and they had been waiting in a pocket dimension, prepared specifically for this moment, and a place where guardian magic could not reach, and where dragon flames could not burn, and the architects had been patient for so long, and now it was time to play their game. Maya looked up at, and some unspoken communication passed between them in an instant, and then Maya turned to Lisa, and the ancient being's expression was almost apologetic. Maya said, "Commander Hayes," and she said Lisa needed to get everyone off this planet immediately, and right now without delay. Lisa started to say that they could not just evacuate an entire colony, but Maya interrupted her. Maya said Lisa did not understand, and Maya were about to do something that would make this world uninhabitable for at least a century. And it was the only way to contain this many architects in one place, and Lisa needed to get her people out, and she had 30 minutes to evacuate. Lisa wanted to argue and wanted to demand a better plan and wanted to do anything except watch this immortal warrior preparing to sacrifice a human colony to stop an enemy that should not exist anymore. But the look in Maya's violet eyes stopped her, and it was the look of someone who had made this choice before, and who knew exactly what it would cost. Lisa said finally to make it count, and then she ran for the nearest communications center. Behind her, Maya and her dragon began to sing, and the universe itself started to scream in response. The evacuation of New Portland was pure chaos given physical form, and Lisa coordinated everything from the central command post with her voice growing hoarse from shouting orders, as transport ships loaded civilians with desperate speed and efficiency. And through the observation windows, she could see the sky bleeding colors that had no names in any language and reality itself, was fracturing under the weight of powers that no modern species was meant to witness or understand. Maya stood at the center of the commercial district, surrounded by a growing sphere of violet and gold light that pulsed with raw power, and the architects poured through their dimensional rift like a plague of fallen stars and hundreds of them, and each one radiating power that made the air shimmer and twist and bend, and the ground beneath them had turned to glass, and then to crystal, and then to something that existed in too many dimensions to properly perceive with normal senses. Morgan reported that the last transport would be lifting off in 5 minutes, but Commander, there were still 3,000 people in the northern settlements, and they could not reach them in time with current resources. Lisa's jaw clenched tight, and she asked how long until Maya's spell activated and released its power. Said based on the energy readings building up, it would be 23 minutes and maybe less if the power kept accelerating. 23 minutes to save 3,000 lives or let them die, because she could not move fast enough, and it was the kind of choice that would haunt Lisa for the rest of her life, no matter what decision she made. Then the tactical display flickered, and Maya's voice came through on a communication channel that should not have existed, and Maya said, "Commander Hayes, keep loading your transports," and she said she was buying them more time. On the screen, Lisa watched as the sphere of light around Maya and suddenly exploded outward like a supernova and slamming into the advancing architects like a tidal wave of pure force. And the enemy beings were thrown backwards, and their orderly advance completely disrupted, and several of the nearest architects simply ceased to exist and erased by power that rewrote the fundamental equations of their existence. But there were so many of them still coming, and for every architect that fell, 2 more emerged from the dimensional rift, and they began to surround Maya, and from all sides, and forming a perfect sphere of their own, and one made of mathematical precision and predatory patience. The lead architect called out, and her voice carrying despite all the chaos around them, and she said, "Impressive display, but ultimately futile, and Maya could not maintain that level of power output forever, and her magic was not infinite, but their numbers were." Maya did not respond with words at all, and instead she reached up and placed one hand against its massive jaw with gentleness, and the dragon lowered her enormous head, and for a moment the 2 beings were perfectly still with foreheads touching in a gesture of absolute trust and complete understanding. Then they began to change and transform. Lisa had seen bonded pairs merge before in old historical footage from the ancient architect war, but that had been a temporary joining with 2 beings sharing power while maintaining their individual forms and separate identities, and this was something completely different and something final and irreversible. Maya's body began to glow from within, and her form becoming translucent as she literally dissolved into streams of pure concentrated energy, and those streams flowed upward like rivers of light, and weaving themselves into scales and merging with the dragon's very essence, and in turn was transforming as well, and her physical form was compressing and condensing, even as her presence in reality expanded exponentially outward. The lead architect whispered no, and for the first time there was real fear in her ancient voice, and she said that was forbidden, and even Maya would not dare to do such a thing. This mental voice thundered in every mind on the planet and across the entire star system, and she said they chose to burn bright rather than fade slow, and they chose to end as they began and together, and defiant and free. The transformation completed in a blaze of light, and where dragon and elf had stood moments before, there was now a single being that all description and all understanding, and it had its general shape, but was made entirely of condensed magic and dragon fire, and a star given will and purpose, and Maya's consciousness was visible in its eyes, and in the patterns of light that danced across its form, and in the terrible beauty of its existence. Lisa understood immediately what she was witnessing, and it was not a temporary battle form that would fade after the fight, and it was permanent fusion and complete and total in Maya, and had sacrificed their individual existence to become something greater and something powerful enough to face an entire army of architects alone, and something that would burn itself out completely in the process. The unified being spoke with two voices perfectly harmonized as one, and it said, "You wanted entertainment, old enemy, and let me show you what it means to face beings who have something worth dying for." What happened next would be classified by every galactic government for generations, and studied by scientists who could not understand it, and ultimately declared incomprehensible by all current physics and understanding, and the being that had been Maya, and moved with speed that bypassed normal spacetime completely, and appearing simultaneously in dozens of locations at once, and where it struck, architects did not simply die, and they were unmade, and their existence retroactively edited out of reality itself. But the architects were not defenseless against such power, and they had 60,000 years to prepare for this moment, and to study their enemies' weaknesses and capabilities, and to develop counters to every known ability, and they fought back with weapons that twisted causality into knots and bombs that exploded backward through time itself, and attacks that struck at probability and possibility themselves. The commercial district of New Portland ceased to exist in any meaningful sense that physics could describe, and the battle had transcended physical space completely, and moving into dimensions that human sensors could not detect, and human minds could not process without breaking, and all Lisa could see were the aftereffects rippling outward in buildings that aged 10,000 years in mere seconds, and areas where gravity reversed itself completely, and pockets of frozen time that would remain locked and sealed for centuries to come. Shouted that all transports were away, and every civilian was off-planet and safe. Lisa asked, what about Maya, even though she already knew the answer in her heart? On screen, the unified being was still fighting with everything it had, but its light was dimming noticeably, and every attack it launched consumed more of its essence, and its very existence, and every defense burned away another piece of what it had been, and the architects were falling in large numbers, but they just kept coming endlessly, and an endless tide of ancient hate and patient malice. The lead architect stood apart from the main battle, and watching with an expression that might have been satisfaction and triumph, and she called out, asking if Maya could see now. And she said this is what the Guardians had become, and martyrs and sacrifices, and they could have ruled this galaxy, and shaped it according to their will. But instead they chose to die protecting creatures who would never understand what they gave up for them. The unified being turned its fatting gaze toward the lead architect, and when it spoke there was no anger in its voice at all, and only pity and sadness. It said softly that was why they won 60,000 years ago, and why they would win now, and they did not fight to rule or dominate, and they fought so that others might have the chance to find their own path forward, and the architect would never understand that simple truth, and that was why she would always lose in the end. With those final words, the being that had been Maya, and did something impossible even by the standards of impossible things already witnessed, and it inverted itself completely, and turning its own existence inside out and transforming from a being of pure power into a spell of unprecedented complexity and reach. The effect was instantaneous and absolute and undeniable, and the dimensional rift sealed shut with a sound like reality healing, and the attacking architects found themselves suddenly bound in place, and their connection to their home dimension severed completely, and one by one they began to fade away, and their forms losing cohesion as they were pulled back into the pocket reality they had hidden in for so long. The lead architect screamed and said no, and this was not possible, and they calculated every variable and planned for every contingency. The fatting voice of Maya and whispered together, and said, you forgot one variable and love, and you forgot what beings will do when they have something worth protecting and worth dying for. The last thing Lisa saw before all the energy signatures finally dispersed completely was a flash of violet and gold light, and a dragon's roar echoing across dimensions and an elf's laughter, and all woven together in a final note of defiance and joy and triumph. Then they were gone forever. 6 months later, Lisa Hayes stood in the memorial park that had been constructed on the restored New Portland colony, and the battle site had been cleaned as much as possible, though strange phenomena still occurred there regularly, and sometimes people reported seeing a violet glow in the corner of their eye, and occasionally children claimed they could hear a dragon singing in their dreams at night. The memorial itself was beautifully simple, and a statue of a woman with pointed ears standing beside a massive dragon and both looking toward the stars above, and the inscription carved into the base read Maya, and in Guardians and Heroes, and remembered forever. A voice said Commander Hayes from behind her. Lisa turned to find a young woman approaching and perhaps 20 years old with features that seemed strangely familiar somehow, and she had bright green eyes and auburn hair, and when she smiled, Lisa felt her breath catch in recognition. The woman said she was sorry to disturb Lisa and her name was, and then she paused seeming uncertain, and said she was Maya's daughter in a way. Lisa blinked in surprise, and she said she thought Maya told her that her people could not reproduce anymore. Agreed and said not in the traditional sense no, but before the binding, Maya left something behind for the future and a seed of possibility encoded in magic and stored in a place outside time itself. And when Maya and made their sacrifice, that seed activated and grew and was what grew from it, and part elf and part human and part dragon and part pure magic, and she was something entirely new. She looked up at the statue with an unreadable expression, and she said there were others like her and 23 of them scattered across the galaxy, and all children of bonded pairs who knew they might one day have to make the ultimate sacrifice. And they were not as powerful as their parents, but they were enough, and enough to continue watching, and enough to stand between the darkness and the light. Lisa studied the young woman more carefully now, and yes, she could see it clearly, and the way she held herself and the depth in her eyes, and the sense of something ancient and wise wearing a young face. Lisa said so, the Guardians were not really gone after all. Agreed and said no, and they were just different now and younger, and hopefully wiser than before, and her mother spent 60,000 years preventing the younger races from destroying themselves, and wanted to think her generation could do better than that, and not by limiting them, but by standing beside them and as allies instead of watchful parents. She extended her hand forward and said if Lisa was willing, she would like to work with humanity openly, this time with no more shadows and no more secrets, and just partnership between species who all wanted to see this galaxy survive and thrive and grow. Lisa looked at the offered hand for a long moment and thinking about everything that had happened, and about the terror of discovering beings like gods hidden among them, and about the sacrifice Maya had made, and about the future that could exist if different species learned to truly trust one another. She took his hand and shook it firmly with conviction. Lisa said welcome to the Partnership Guardian, and she thought Maya would be very proud. Smiled, and for just a moment her eyes flashed violet like her mother's, and somewhere in the distance thunder that was not thunder rolled across the sky, and those who listened closely swore they could hear a dragon's approving roar. The Guardians had changed, but they endured and survived. And the galaxy, for all its dangers and darkness, had a real chance to find its own path to the stars, and not alone but together.